Best looking cars of the 1980s, you say? Well, what would be on that list? I have to admit that it's a little bit tough to pick some of these vehicles. It's not like the 1950s or 1960s or even the early 1970s, where there's quite a few vehicles that you can select that were great looking. At least on the domestic side, the 1980s weren't always kind to vehicles, although there were a number of standouts. And what we're going to focus on here are domestically sold vehicles and domestically produced cars, not cars from the foreign automakers. But I have to say, I think that the 1980s were a decade that probably helped turn more people to foreign vehicles than any other decade before that, in part because of the quality of American cars that had plummeted significantly from, let's say, the early 1970s, late 1960s to that point. And also the styling wasn't necessarily avant-garde or cutting edge or even all that inspirational often. I think one of my favorite vehicles of the 1980s would be the Mercedes SEC coupes, like the one that you see here, that continued on into the 1990s. In fact, this is a 1990 version that's available on Bring a Trailer today. I wish that I had the money to afford the repair bills for these vehicles. And another favorite of mine would be the Porsche 928. But again, those aren't domestically produced vehicles. We're going to focus on the latter for this particular video. Let me know if you think I missed anything and put a comment in the comment section. Let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have the Chrysler LeBaron Coupe for 1987. Now, for 1987, Chrysler released this LeBaron Coupe, and I have to say that this car, to me, represents an excellent bridge between the super boxy K cars and the LH cars of the early 1990s. This LeBaron, as it came out in 1987, I think was actually a pretty contemporary-looking vehicle. One would say somewhat European-inspired, but it's not too boxy, it's not too soft. And to me, it just hits all of the right elements. I love the slightly raked nose and that kind of Grecian-style grille. I don't mind it on this car, actually. One might think that it's kind of an anachronism given the rest of the body is so sleek, but I actually think it looks good and appropriate on the car. The body sides are super clean and relatively unadorned. I also enjoy kind of the reverse rake to the deck lid and what may have been, at least at some point in the proposal, a full taillight, full width taillight, but of course that got costed out and these just had regular tail lamps. And well, you at least had the visual look that that was a full width taillight out rear. And the curved backlight, that had to have been an expensive piece for Chrysler during the era. It's just an overall handsome looking car with low belt line. Notice the belt line is lower than the backlight. And you have a relatively chunky C-pillar, but I don't think it looks bad on this car. It also has this beautiful tapered look to the midsection. Notice the lower portion of the body by the door there. It kind of goes up to really help slim the visual height of this vehicle and make it look more athletic. To me, this is one of Chrysler's early masterpieces. I think many people talk about the LH cars, like I said, of the early 1990s. But this car was really the beginning, I think, of a rebirth of styling for Chrysler after a intensely boxy era. Even the interior on these vehicles was quite nice. The seats and the interior materials were nice, and they finally got rid of the super digital gauges and had more analog style instrumentation that was very European of the era. Have to say, this is one of my favorite cars, kind of unknown, very rare today, and it makes it in the list at number 10. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have the 1988 Cadillac Seville STS. This one is sure to generate some controversy. Cadillac downsized its Seville for the 1986 model year and did so severely. The same was true of the Eldorado, which had already been through a downsizing for the 1979 model year. And unfortunately, buyers just did not respond to these vehicles. Neither the Seville nor the Eldorado were good sellers. But I would contend that doesn't mean that the Seville in particular is a bad-looking car. In fact, I think it's one of the best-looking GM cars of the 80s. It's got a very tidy package to it. It has very clean body sides. I love the toothpick-style A-pillars and the vertical yet very thin C-pillar. The car looks delicate and yet substantial, and of course it has the trademark Seville round wheel arches. And because of the size of the car, perhaps the wheels actually look pretty big especially for the era, and relatively well proportioned. Now, I picked the STS because it has some different details versus the normal Seville that I think make it look a bit more youthful. And the overall design and proportion of these cars I think is good. Unfortunately, they just weren't commercially successful because imagine somebody was driving a bustleback Seville, came in with their leased vehicle and wanted the next generation Seville and saw this, and they thought, this is just not for me. The 76 to 79 Seville was very understated and tasteful, and this 88 Seville STS, and even the one that came out in 86, was a bit of a return to that type of a form with that very vertical C-pillar and the loss of the bustleback out back. But it just was too small, and these cars followed on the heels of the N cars, GM's Pontiac Grand Am, Olds Calais, as well as the Buick Somerset that came out in 1985, and they were effectively the same size, and they were priced higher. That's never a recipe for success. And these cars were actually supposed to be about, I believe, 80 millimeters narrower before they were released for production. So at the very last minute, the car was widened in the middle by about 3 inches, and that helped it. Imagine this car being even narrower. But I have to say, I really do enjoy the 88 Seville STS in particular because not only is the exterior good looking, but the interior was really nice. It had beautiful real wood on the door panels, the dash, the center consoles, and high-quality leather, high-quality materials. It was a trim package. It was a very small vehicle. It did come with a 4.5-liter throttle body injected V8 underhood. It actually was a good engine by this point. It was a refinement of the HT4100 engine that was introduced for 1982. And the cars kind of drive nicely. So I have to say, this is one of my favorite little lookers of the 80s. An honorable mention would be the 86 Tornado would be another one that's my favorite. And I don't think these cars get any love because they just were not good sellers, but that doesn't mean they weren't good lookers. I just think it was a failure on the part of the marketing team and also the program planning team to try to think that you could move somebody from the previous generation Seville and the Tornado into this car. By the way, if you want to learn more about this generation of GM design, be sure to check out my friend John Manoogian's Driven to Right column. I'll put a link in the video description so you can read all about his career, including about this Seville. And of course, there are interviews on this channel with John even about this car too. I'll put a link as well in the comment section. Let's turn now to number 8. And for number 8, we go back to the Mopar guys with the 1981 to 1983 Imperial. Now, Imperial had not been a standalone marque for a number of years, in particular after 1975 when Imperial just went away and the Chrysler New Yorker Brougham became the top-of-the-line vehicle for Chrysler. But in 1981, Chrysler revived the Imperial as a standalone marque, or at least tried to, and came out with this vehicle. Now remember, this was the era of the so-called bustleback, and there was the 1980 Seville, which came first. Then there was the 81 Imperial that you see here, and then there was also the 1982 Continental. But I think of the trio, despite the fact that I own a bustleback Seville and love it, I kind of have to say that the 81 Imperial perhaps wore the bustleback the best. The 82 Continental is probably my least favorite. And the bustleback Seville, I would put it kind of equal with this Imperial, but I think the Imperial actually even looks a little bit better. Now, despite being an Imperial, this particular vehicle had very, let's say, pedestrian beginnings. The Chrysler F-body, Aspen Volare platform, later the M-body, and this was really a J-body Chrysler that was based on both those F and M platforms. And the J-body served as the underpinnings not only for the Imperial that you see here, but also the Cordoba and the Murata. And the underpinnings were, like I said, very pedestrian. They did have the Torsion bar front suspension, leaf spring rear, and the Imperial was luxurious, but it just wasn't up to par in terms of being a true luxury vehicle. Chrysler did everything they could during this capital-constrained time to really elevate the Imperial, including outfitting it with an extremely troublesome electronic fuel injection system that Chrysler ended up recalling all of them and replacing them for free with carburetors under hood. And actually, it was a pretty extensive retrofit that included not only a new intake manifold and carburetor, but a new dash cluster, as well as a new fuel tank. It was very expensive for Chrysler to retrofit these. And I have to say, if you're going to get one, some people online will say, oh, I have the fuel-injected one. It runs just fine, no issues. My best advice, find one with a factory conversion carb kit under hood, and you'll know that you'll have something that's quite reliable. The fuel injection units are troublesome, and now the parts are hard to get. Allegedly, it was so troublesome that even Frank Sinatra ended up ditching the car after it kept stalling on him. His personal car kept stalling on him. And you know it's bad when the car has a shutdown module that if it detects something wrong, it'll actually stop the car from running, and you have to put the car in park and fully cycle the key all the way off in order for it to restart. Not great. But the design of the 81 to 83 Imperial, I think, is pretty stunning. I love that Grecian-style front grille, the rake to the front end. The front overhang is a little bit extreme. And I have to say, the license plate and how it's outfitted into the deck lid kind of bothers me. I almost would want to fill it in so that it's just a smooth surface back there and relocate the license plate somewhere else. But the humped trunk styling and the C-pillar, I think, really works on this car, and it does look rich and luxurious from the outside. The interiors were not too bad on these cars. They did have Mark Cross leather interior, to go along with the digital dash. And if you've ever sat in one of these, you'll notice that there is carpeting or like the headliner on every single surface, from the A pillars to the C pillars to obviously the headliner itself. It's kind of humorous. Unfortunately, nowadays, that the headliner has kind of come undone and is often sagging, as are most of the other trim pieces in these vehicles. But from an exterior perspective, I think this is one of the more captivating cars of the 1980s and certainly a looker. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have the 1984 Lincoln Mark 7. Now, the Mark 7 was such a dramatic departure from the Mark that preceded it, the Mark 6, which was this extremely boxy, flatlined affair that was the last of the Jean Bourdonnais era of style from the Ford Motor Company. And the Mark 7 just took the Mark series into a completely new, and I would say thankfully new, direction. That Mark 6 just looked so tired by the time that it came out, and I think the aesthetic had worn a bit thin. Although I can't completely say that, because a lot of the Panther platform cars, like the LTD, the Grand Marquis, were highly successful, and even the town car of the 1980s, and they were extremely boxy. But I think it was time to move on, and the Mark did for 1984. It was actually the first car that domestically had composite headlamps. And I debated putting the Mark 7 on here versus the 1983 Aerobird, which also was a very handsome vehicle. Ford was really going in an aerodynamically styled direction at this time, well ahead of GM or Chrysler, and frankly, kind of took the styling crown away from GM during the time frame. And I think it was all for the better. We're going to talk about another Ford vehicle from the 80s in a little bit that really was the style leader that I think set the tone for styling, arguably even up to today. But the Mark 7 was really this perfect blend of modern and historic styling. You notice that from the front you have the kind of Mark III, Mark IV-esque grille up front, the Rolls-Royce style grille that was, of course, trademark to the Mark series. Out back you have the faux Continental spare tire hump. But aside from that, you have a very modern shape and a sleek shape, especially with these nice aircraft doors, and maybe even the Mark 7 robs a little bit from the Tornado in terms of the body side with the wheel arches and the feature line that continues down the length of the body, although it's certainly less exaggerated. And you have a very un-Ford-like shape. Compare the Mark 7 with the Mark 6 that has perfectly flat fenders and quarters, and here you have this beautiful leading ascending fender line on the Mark 7, and you have kind of a tapered rear. It's just not very Ford-like, or at least not very typical of Ford from the Bourdonnais era, and that's because by this point, Ford styling leadership had changed, and Jack Telnack had taken over along with his team. Telnack had spent time not only in Ford of Europe, but also Ford of Australia, and he just had a completely different, and thankfully different, design aesthetic that he brought to these vehicles. And I think the Mark 7 is the perfect example of one of those cars that can bridge both the modern day as well as the past. And I think it still looks, frankly, quite good, especially the later LSC versions that had a little bit different trim on them. Those are pretty gosh darn sweet. Fortunately, I would say the interior wasn't anything all that special. It wasn't bad, wasn't great. The materials were pretty good. But I think the theme was not as great as some other vehicles from the time. Although Ford did have a version of the Mark VII where the interior had a very large computer. That one just didn't make it through to production. But yeah, the final version wasn't too bad. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we are switching to pickups and the 1988 Chevrolet and I guess GMC CK pickup. Now, pickup, you say, what in the world is that doing on here? Well, the GMT 400 pickups that were introduced in 1988 were really a seminal design and were a landslide success. Remember, these pickups were replacing pickups that were introduced for the 1973 model year. So they had been around all the way since that period of time, the kind of classic boxy pickup shape. And for 1988, Chevrolet and GMC introduced much more sleek, aerodynamic looking, and smooth pickups that really were, again, just industry trendsetters, especially when you compare them to the environment in which they were designed, that of the bullnose Ford pickups. And even, after the bullnose was refined a little bit, it still looked dated compared to these pickups, and especially the Dodge Ram pickups. Well, they were almost going through their high school birthday by the time these 88 CK pickups came out. Now, this front three-quarter view shows a number of styling elements that I like about these 88 CK pickups, namely the super clean body sides that really are devoid of significant creases. There are definitely creases at the top and at the bottom, but there aren't a lot of ins and outs like there was on the 1973 through the 1987 pickup trucks. And you do have nicely sculpted wheel arches with a little bit of a fillet there that provides a nice reflection. And I do like how the hood and the fender slope downward just at the very end there as the hood mates up with the grille. Now, I don't particularly care for the steel beam headlamps that they had for the introductory model years. Later, that would become a composite headlamp, but I think it looked a lot better. And the grille looks a little bit cheap, I would say. Here, it does have kind of that egg crate, rectangular egg crate texture that is okay, but that would get refined over time as well. Regardless, these GMT 400 pickups are just seminal pickups for the time, and the interiors also were very, very nice. Completely new themes, lots of electronics, and the buttons were made to be pushed with a gloved hand so that you could operate them with no significant issues. They also ride phenomenally well compared to the prior generation pickups. These pickups kind of almost have a car-like ride, certainly by today's standards. So the GMT 400 pickups really were a milestone in terms of having car-like refinement and comfort. And they were just great overall pickups, certainly a step up in the comfort direction over the prior generation General Motors pickups. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have the 1979 to 1985 Eldorado. So while this car was introduced in 1979, it had a number of model years, 1980, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, in the 1980s. And this was the best-selling Eldorado of all time, the 1979 to 85 Eldorado. In some years, it was selling 70,000 units. It's pretty remarkable when you think about the 1967 Eldorado. The first front-wheel drive Eldorado sold 17,000 units, not 70. So big dramatic increase, and it's no wonder. This car looks spectacular. It really has that kind of crease in the pants look that you would associate with Cadillac. Obviously has the vertical tail lamps, very clean body sides, and especially when it's devoid of the vinyl roof, I love the extremely crisp edge on the C-pillar and the roof. It kind of just tightens the car over up, tightens the upper up, and gives it a look that I think is much more refined than the Biarritz-trimmed models that have the stainless steel cap that kind of harkens back to the Eldorado Bromes of the 50s, and the vinyl roof, which really dilutes that crisp edge. It just doesn't look quite the same when it has a vinyl roof. Now, the car that you are seeing here is not a Biarritz. This doesn't have the stainless steel cap on it, but it is a standard Eldorado with the vinyl roof, and you see what I mean. The vinyl roof, it's padded, so it really dilutes the overall look, at least in my opinion, of the rear of the car. But take a look at the body sides here, just a beautifully convex section, Very clean. Too bad that this car has the body side molding as well as the door edge guard. Just imagine it without that. And you can see how clean this would be, and also how crisp the wheel arches are. They're relatively muted, but they are crisp. This car would also start the trend, I would say, that would continue with the front-wheel drive General Motors vehicles, of having a more exaggerated height to the deck lid, a higher deck lid than the belt line. You can see the belt line kind of sweeps up there at the rear quarter glass. And that really sets up this elevated quarter panel and deck lid that squishes the rear window down. So notice the backlight is relatively small compared to the side glass. And you would see that on Cadillacs, even the downsized ones of the 1980s. This deck lid that was relatively high, a belt line that was relatively low. That was kind of very typical of GM during the era. Now, the interior of these Eldorados was also quite handsome. Big hooded dash panel. They did have faux wood grain, unfortunately. But the overall interior does feel rich. The carpeting is great and heavy pile carpeting. And the dash, I think the instruments aren't necessarily all that great, but the door panels are beautiful. The seats are beautiful. And I will say, owning a 1984 Seville, which is effectively the same car, but with four doors, these cars do have a great ride to them. They are very quiet, very refined. The only downside is if you get a 1982 to 1985 model, you're getting the HT4100 V8 engine, which is not great and not very powerful. I would recommend, if you can, get a 79 to 81. The 79s have the Oldsmobile 350 fuel-injected V8. It was a Cadillac exclusive. The 1980 and 81 models have the Cadillac 368 cubic inch engine with digital fuel injection, this throttle body injection. The 81 is a V8 6.4, the cylinder deactivation engine, but you can easily just deactivate that and drive it around as a V8. It's very reliable. So that's this one on the list. Let's move on to the next one. And at number 4, we have the 1984 to 88 Pontiac Fiero. Well, we're getting down to the fun ones now. The Fiero was introduced for the 1984 model year, and it was sold to GM's top brass as a commuter car, kind of a secretary's car that was an efficient mode of transportation. It was not originally intended to be a sports car or even a sporty car. But of course, the looks of the car made it appear that it was indeed a sports car, and GM would remedy the lack of power in these Fieros very shortly after the inaugural model year by introducing a 2.8-liter V6 engine to supplement the standard 2.5-liter Iron Duke four-cylinder engine, which was, let's say, at home powering a tractor, but not necessarily a sporty vehicle, or at least one that looks sporty like the Fiero. The Fiero that you see here that was introduced for 1984, I think, is one of the most beautiful cars of the 80s. It's just clean, simple, elegant, very Fiat X19-ish, but, well, let's just say it's American in its own way with some Italian flair. And it's one of the few Pontiacs of all time, of the post-1959 era, I guess I should say, that doesn't have a split grille up front. There are a few others, like the Pontiac 6000 STE of some years, but this is one of very few Pontiacs that doesn't have that theme. It also has something that was pretty popular at the time, this rub strip that goes around the entire vehicle that almost serves as the widest point as well of the car. And I think that was purposeful in terms of, let's say, helping prevent various door dings, etc., but it also looked quite good. Now, the Fiero also had something that helped it resist door dings, and that was that its body panels were composite as opposed to sheet metal, which helped it from rusting. At least those panels didn't rust. Of course, the underbody was indeed steel and metal, and so the underbody components could get a little crusty. In order to save costs in getting this vehicle to market, the Fiero did use some parts bin elements, including a Chevette-style front suspension and then an X or A car kind of front suspension as the rear suspension because this was a mid-engine vehicle. And, it worked. Pontiac did redo the suspension for the 1988 model year, the final model year. But, the car, as you can see here, just even in its inaugural model year, had this beautiful look to it. And I love how the designers kind of disguised the otherwise fat C-pillar by putting this fake pane of glass there that was a blackout pane of glass to just visually slim the C-pillar. What a brilliant trick. Now, there was another variant of the Fiero, the GT version that you see here with the flying buttress rear end, just a completely different rear end as well as a front fascia. And I think both of the Fieros, candidly, look really good. It's hard to pick which one is my favorite. The GT is, I would say, a little bit sportier and Yeah, it does have kind of a more athletic stance with that lower body cladding slash kit to it. And both of them have the so-called Hoover air intake. You can see it there ahead of the rear wheel. That is the intake for the engine. And when you have the windows down and you're in the driver's seat, I remember when I first had my 88 Fiero GT, I thought it had a vacuum leak because you hear this hissing noise. It's just the intake for the engine. Amazingly, some of these Fieros now are commanding relatively high prices, especially if you have a GT with the 5-speed and T-tops and all the options. And if it has low miles, you might be kind of paying in the mid-20s or even higher for one now. I paid, I think, $6,000 for my 1988 GT that was this color, this exact color scheme, and it was an automatic. It only had, I think, 28,000 miles, somewhere thereabouts, and I sold it about a year and a half later for $7,000, and I was thrilled. Well, oh well, probably be worth more than that today, but it was a fun car while I had it. The interior of these Fieros was also pretty cool with a so-called modular dash theme. They did win a number of industrial design awards. And if you want to see more about the Fiero interior design, take a look at the interviews on my channel with Marv Fisher, who is Pontiac's assistant chief interior designer during that time frame. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have a car that set the styling direction for the 80s, the 86 Taurus and Sable. When it was introduced in 1986, the Ford Taurus really just set all the domestic auto companies back on their heels, especially GM, who was designing those vehicles in the style of the 1976 to 79 Seville with the very chunky vertical C-pillar. And of course, this Ford Taurus that you see here is the antithesis of this. Kind of launched the so-called jelly bean-like styling, but I think that that is an overly critical way to describe the 86 Taurus. This, to me, is a beautiful family sedan. One could say it's a bit of a copy of the Audi 5000, and I think that's a fair criticism. But there's no denying that this was pretty avant-garde when it came to styling, at least for domestic automobiles at the time. And it's super clean. Love the very glassy upper, the 6-window upper. And I will say there's only one thing that kind of bothers me about the styling of this car, and that's that there's a relatively pronounced wheel arch for the front wheel, but nothing for the rear. And I suspect that's because that a wheel arch would have interfered with the rear door cut you can see there, and so they just dropped it. That kind of bothers me a little bit. But still, what a beautifully styled car, especially where you have this lower body section that's a different color, kind of slims the body overall, makes it look very trim. I love how the fender wraps over the top and kind of curls inboard toward the hood. Just a great vehicle overall. Of course, I have to say that my, let's say, more favorite version of this is the Mercury Sable, because you have the light bar front end, which I think is just awesome. Although you never saw these without at least one lamp burned out back in the day. And then you have the semi-skirted rear wheel, which you didn't have on the Taurus, and the ribbed lower body cladding, similar to 1970s era and later Mercedes. It just was a super sweet family sedan. On the inside, it was a very Eurocentric cockpit too. I would say Ford really sweated the details in terms of ergonomics on these vehicles, went European with the rotary knobs and dials as opposed to the slider bars. And that was very well received. I actually read an interview with one of the designers on this, or the chief designer, Jack Telnack, where he said that they were surprised that ladies in particular liked those rotary knobs because it reminded them of their kitchen appliances. Don't hate me, that is what he said verbatim, and so it was intuitive. But the 86 Taurus and Sable, again, were just seminal vehicles for their time, and I think really caused GM to think and pivot to a totally different design direction. Also helped that GM's design vice president was retiring around this time. Irv Ribicki was transitioning to Chuck Jordan, who would take GM design in an entirely different direction, but perhaps a little bit precipitated by the Ford Taurus you see here. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have the new for 1984 Corvette. The 84 Corvette was a dramatic departure from a Corvette that had lasted from 1968 to 1982. There was no 1983 Corvette, or at least there were a few prototypes produced, but the 1984 Corvette marked a pretty stark departure from a car that was significantly aging in 1982. And while the 84 Corvette did share the engine under hood with that 82 model, a Crossfire 350 cubic inch V8, I should say Crossfire injection, twin throttle body injection in 1985, the Corvette would get tuned port injection, a much better setup. But the 84 Vette is certainly a looker. It's amazing how the designers and the design team, led by Jerry Palmer, really toned down a lot of the exaggerated forms of the 68 to 82 variant, but yet kept that overall Corvette shape and the Corvette feel. The power bulge hood is relatively muted. The fender tops aren't as pronounced as the 68 to 82. And the overall shape is just very sleek, and I think it's complemented by that rub strip that runs around the entire vehicle, just like the Fiero that we were talking about before. Although here, that rub strip also denotes the parting line for the hood, which opens in a backward style fashion away from the windshield. And while this Corvette would last all the way in through the mid-1990s, I think the early model years with these wheels and this particular shape before it was refined are actually the most pure. I love the wheels with the little thin slots and veins, and I prefer this rear end as opposed to the rear end that was introduced with the ZR1 with more square taillights. I just prefer this one. I think it looks better. But this car still looks good today. It's one of these 80s era vehicles that, remember, this was designed in the late 70s, early 1980s, and I think the design still holds up today. What a triumph of overall design. I just can't say enough good about this 84 Corvette, except for I wish that the build quality were better. I will say that. And the interior was a lot of black plastic everywhere, hard black plastic, which is unfortunate because I think the exterior of the car deserves something a little bit better than the video gamey interior, which that doesn't bother me so much as the overall fit and finish of the interior. That just wasn't up to par. Especially the early model years were a bit creaky and rattly, and you sit in a pit here because of how the structure is engineered and the significant tuck-in of the body, which squeezes the structure relatively high. So you've got to kind of step over it and sit in a pit in the seat. But hey, it was a sports car for the time and a no-compromise sports car and a great-looking one. And now we arrive at my nomination for best-looking car of the 80s. That is the 1982 Firebird, and maybe the Camaro too. But I think the Firebird is a little bit better. Take a look at this advertising shot that says, "Your time has come," and it has this picture of a beautiful red 1982 Trans Am. This is one of the sexiest looking cars from any angle. And it's amazing because it's just such a distinct departure from sports cars as you would envision them today. Today, sports cars often have a wedge profile, a rising belt line, a tall rear end, kind of a very low nose. And this one is not like that at all. Take a look and you can see here that the belt line is relatively flat on this 82 Trans Am. There is this beautiful kind of arcing curve that forms the top of the fender as it slopes down to the front end of the vehicle. And just trace your finger from the start of the vehicle and follow that curve upward, and then it levels off. And then it also kind of raises again as it gets towards the rear quarter and the C-pillar. I love the basket handle styling of this 82 Trans Am. I wish this car didn't have that body side molding. I think it would look a lot better without that. But, still a great looking car, especially these early model years with the bowling ball hubcaps, that these were actually intended to be covers, and behind them, the designers intended to have just a different wheel. So you could select if you wanted the covers on or off, and it was going to look good either way. But, well, that's not how it made it through to production. But just an absolutely gorgeous vehicle from any angle that you look at it. Here's a better shot where you can see all the reflections on the vehicle, and notice how beautiful the reflections are, particularly on the body side around the wheel arches that have sculpture, but they're not overly crisp and not overly dull. They just look right. And this red one, just like the brochure color, I think looks absolutely fantastic. And it looks fine with 15-inch wheels because the overall height of the body over top of the wheels isn't very large. So you don't have to have these huge 20-plus inch wheels on this car to make it look good. I think it looks just fine with the 15 inches that it has. I also think that the asymmetrical hood scoop is just a piece of sculptural beauty. mean, look at how it fades out as it goes to the front end of the hood and just gradually rises. Some designer really sweated the details, or clay modeler really sweated the details for that hood scoop. And I think they did a fantastic job. This car was executed by the same studio that did the Fiero that I mentioned previously, under the direction of John Chanella. And, I just can't find any fault with this car. Every single angle looks good. Front, or as you see here at the rear, it's just a sexy and beautiful car. Unfortunately, the build quality sucked, particularly in the early model years. They're rattle traps. They have awfully plastic interiors. The theme of the interior isn't bad. It just has terrible materials. And I think that, that's really the Achilles heel of these cars. I've owned this vehicle since 2005, the one that you see here. And I, toy with selling it because I don't necessarily think it's the best riding car. The suspension isn't bad, but it's a bit creaky despite being a low mileage, 35,000 mile car. I think I bought it with 28,000 miles almost 20 years ago. And, it's always had creaks and moans and things like that, and they all did. Just an unfortunate consequence of these early F-bodies, but the styling just makes me keep it. And at this point, I've had it for almost 20 years. I'm just going to keep it. So that is the 82 Trans Am. I also have to give an honorable mention to the 82 Camaro. I think that is an extremely sexy car, great looking as well, but I would say not quite as good looking as the Firebird and the Trans Am. You let me know. Put a comment in the comment section. So what did you think of this top 10 list? Did I miss any? Do you disagree? Do you agree? Make sure to comment. Be sure to comment, like, and subscribe. Thanks again for watching. And be sure to check out in the description section the links to John Manoogian's Drive to Write columns and some interviews with John Manoogian on my channel.